too many Americans take for granted the right to vote and don't understand that unless we fight for the right to vote, unless we try to include as many people as possible, our democracy is put at risk.
This right to vote is bloody. It is contested. And the reason it is contested is because the vote matters.
Register, inform yourself, and vote. Register, inform yourself, and vote. A country doesn't run itself. Every voter is a help.
There are those who argue that America is not a democracy or a republic. We are a democratic republic because we use democracy to elect our representatives.
What is democracy? Democracy is a system in which the voters choose the people that govern them.
I vote for every election. I don't care what it is. I don't miss voting. And my voice, I want to be heard.
That's what it's supposed to be.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she is determined to push for mail-in voting across the country in the next relief bill.
The things they had in there were crazy. They had things, levels of voting that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
When elected officials feel like they may not have the power anymore, they have two choices. They can either be more responsive to those they lead, or they can eliminate the people they have to answer to.
I registered to vote at DMV about 9 months ago. I found out 3 weeks ago that I wasn't registered.
Progress doesn't only go in one direction. We've had expansions of American democracy, but we've also had times when things have moved backwards, where people have lost the right to vote.
A monumental decision by the Supreme Court changing the Voting Rights Act, the law of the land for 48 years.
History is never a straight line. It's always a fight.
If everybody's vote was important and equal, then why are certain people in certain areas of certain backgrounds, why is their vote being limited?
Now, some call it a safeguard for the integrity of New Hampshire elections. Others see it as a political ploy to try and keep voters away from the polls.
I just think it should be a little more difficult to vote. There's nothing unconstitutional about literacy tests.
The fight over voting rights is ultimately about power.
Districts have been scrambled all over the state of Texas in the past, and they elected white people and nobody questioned it.
Do you believe that democracy exists in America?
Well, I've lived in America all my life, and I've never seen democracy yet, so I don't know what the hell you're talking about.
People in Washington know nothing about reality. They know nothing about what's happening to little people in the community.
But you add it all up, and all of a sudden, people look at their government and think it doesn't represent me. And in many cases, these days, for a lot of reasons, it really doesn't.
In Wisconsin, voters headed to the polls today, the first state to hold a major election with in-person voting in the midst of a stay-at-home order.
Do they expect us to go against public safety?
The United States is the only country that makes it so difficult for communities to own their power by requiring them to jump through hoops to simply participate in basic elections. It's pernicious because it convinces you that maybe it's not worth trying again. And when entire communities become convinced that the process is not for them, we lose their participation in our nation's future, and that's dangerous to everyone.
You cannot understand where we are right now unless you understand the history of voting rights and the struggle for voting rights. Past is prologue. Those forces that are systematically determined to keep American citizens from voting, they have been laying the seeds over time.
When we started as a country, it wasn't really anything like what we would consider a democracy. Only white men who owned property had the right to vote. That was a very small segment of the country, even then.
The Constitution begins with the words, "We the people." And yet, who were the people? It doesn't include slaves. It doesn't include women. It doesn't include Native Americans. It doesn't include young people. So the notion of the people is very restricted.
You won't find sitting anywhere in the articles of the Constitution where it says American citizens have the right to vote. When you have the founders writing in the language of enlightenment, dealing with getting rid of monarchy and getting rid of kings and having this wonderful, beautiful republic. And then you have 6% who are eligible to vote. White, male property owners. It tells you we had a lot of work to do.
I grew up in Gulfport, Mississippi. My dad was a shipyard worker. My mom was the head librarian at William Carey College. Both of my parents were firsts in their family. My mom is the only one of her siblings to finish high school and let alone go to grad school. My dad was the first man in his family to go to college. My mom and dad were very prolific. I am the second of 6 children. My parents were very intentional with us, and we had 3 jobs.
You had to go to church.
Had to go to church.
And you had to go to school.
Go to school and take care of each other.
And in the meantime, you had to do something to help someone else.
We would volunteer at soup kitchens and homeless shelters. If there was someone in need, my parents found a way to make sure we were there to help, which was odd to us because we would point out we were poor too. Why are we serving other people? They would say, having nothing is not an excuse for doing nothing.
I tell you what, when those kids were growing up, every time we voted, we took them with us, and they saw us cast our ballot.
And we'd sort of trail out of the voting booth like make way for ducklings because there were so many of us. But they wanted us to see them in the act of casting a vote. My parents were admitted to Emory University in 1989 to become United Methodist ministers. I was 15, so I was unhappy with the world around me, so I was very excited about moving to Atlanta. I attended Avondale High School, and I became the valedictorian of my high school. When you're valedictorian in Georgia, you get invited to meet the governor of Georgia. It was a Sunday morning. We got dressed, put on our best clothes, and got on the bus because we didn't have a car. We get to the guard gate, and the guard looks at me and he looks at my parents, and he says, "This is a private event. You don't belong here." And my dad says, no, this is my daughter, Stacy. She's one of the valedictorians. But the guard doesn't check his checklist. Instead, I remember very clearly him looking over our shoulders at the bus that's pulling away. And he looks back at us and he basically says, he's like, no, like, you don't belong here. The story he told himself was that these 3 black people getting off a bus, they can't possibly belong in the governor's mansion on this day that's celebrating success and opportunity.
Let them know. Yeah, we winning now. Yeah, we rising to the top. New beginning now. And we never gonna stop. Yeah, we grinning now. Never being wild, but we in here now.
My parents had a very engaged and spirited discussion with this gentleman about his decision-making skills, about his reading comprehension.
Robert had to have a few
It was
choice
explained
words.
to him in a certain way that if you want to stay healthy,
Well-
you look at the list. I won't go no further than that.
What I remember about that day is not meeting the governor. Don't remember meeting my fellow valedictorians. All I remember is this man standing in front of the most powerful place in Georgia telling me I don't belong inside. And that was my first encounter with the governor of Georgia. It never occurred to me to think I could be governor. I had simply never seen it. When I started running, that story for me was an important narrative because it reminded people that Just as I was told I don't belong here, so much of what voting is about is whether you belong, whether you have value. James Baldwin said that people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in people. We can't escape where we come from, but it's our responsibility to reshape what that story looks like.
After the Civil War, the number one question was, what is going to replace slavery? What system of labor? What system of politics? What system of race relations? Reconstruction is the nation's effort to come to terms with the abolition of slavery.
They were trying to figure out, how do we heal this nation? How do we stitch it back together? And then you've got 4 million freed people. How do we do this?
The 3 amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, were not just small-scale changes in an existing structure. They made the Constitution, for the first time, a vehicle through which people could claim greater equality. They actually transformed the Constitution into something new and different. They took slavery out of the Constitution, where it had been embedded. They created for the first time a national definition of citizenship and insisted that all those citizens and other persons in the country had to be treated equally. And they mandated that African American men must have the right to vote.
That amendment in 1870 said the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
The state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
The idea of a national standard for voting was very controversial. During the debates on the 15th Amendment, even northern states wanted to keep control of the voting qualifications because there were people in their state they didn't want voting, and that's not about blacks. California and Oregon did not ratify the 15th Amendment because they were afraid that it might let Chinese people vote. But by 1870, when the 15th Amendment was ratified, black men now had the right to vote in every state in the Union for the first time, and indeed also to hold office.
What Reconstruction offered was a fresh start for America. You had this moment where black citizens enjoyed citizenship. That was evidenced by black men going to the U.S. Senate.
You start having black elected officials in these amazingly high spaces where you would not have imagined them 20 years earlier. That was the power of Reconstruction, and that was the power of the vote.
Please welcome the First Lady of our movement, Mrs. Coretta Scott King.
I welcome all of you, my brothers and sisters, to this 30th anniversary March on Washington. Dr. King's spirit is with us.
When I spoke of the March on Washington, I was 19. I was terrified, and I do not recall to this day actually giving that speech.
I'm delighted now to introduce our next speaker, Stacey Abrams, who is a junior at Spelman College in Atlanta. She has helped mobilize students to be here today, and we are very, very proud of our sister, Stacey Abrams. Stacey.
There was a guy with a clock who told me, you only have X amount of time to speak. And I remember him saying, start.
Jobs, justice, peace. This is a theme that we've been hearing today over and over again. This is the theme.
When you walk onto the stage and you look out over the reflecting pool, I'd never seen that many people in one place in my entire life.
Today we come before you, walking on the road to jobs, the road to peace, the road to justice.
When I was in college, I was very involved in voter registration. What I was concerned about as a young person was how many people weren't taking advantage of this right, of this power. I set up voter registration opportunities, and I would annoy my friends, and they did not care. But I knew how important it was to have this right to vote because I'd remembered my parents teaching me about this. I'd seen what it meant. At Spelman, I used to go to city council meetings. I was starting to understand how government worked, but I was also becoming very aware of how it didn't work. I was protesting. I'd burned the Georgia state flag because it had a Confederate emblem on it. We first tried to get a meeting with the governor to talk about it, and when that wasn't fruitful, we decided to bring attention to it by setting it on fire. Now, I got a burn permit for it, so everyone knew I was doing it. I'm like, I don't have to break the law to make my point.
Stacey Yvonne Abrams, magna cum laude.
I learned at Spelman College I didn't have to limit my goals to what I'd seen other people do.
Today, I come to you as a young person, as a young woman, as a young Black woman, to ask you to use us. Use the young people of the United States of America to pave a road that will last forever.
The first great protest march on the nation's capital ever was for the right to vote for women. In 1913, the day before the presidential inauguration, 5,000 women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. It took pushing and pushing and pushing. It took hunger strikes, picketing in front of the White House. All these creative, nonviolent protests that was new to this country. This was before Gandhi had done a lot of these things. But the women's movement and the fight for women's suffrage introduced them to the United States.
We get to the 19th Amendment that guarantees women the right to vote.
When you look back at how long women fought for the right to vote, we're used to movements now 10 or 20 years and the change happens. Women spent their entire lifetimes fighting for the 19th Amendment.
Black women were instrumental in the passage of the 19th Amendment. And they had been part of this conversation from its beginning. Women who were helping shape opportunity for white women and for Black men. And yet, in each of these conversations, Black women were left out of the narrative. And then post-Reconstruction, Black men who had suddenly become part of the body politic were once again disenfranchised.
The greatest moments of progress are followed by the most intense periods of retrenchment. That's what happened after the Civil War. Reconstruction was a high point for voting rights, and it was followed by nearly 100 years of Jim Crow.
The decision to remove the troops from the South was a decision made by one vote in the Congress. One vote put an end to Reconstruction and started the era of violence and bloodshed and Klan-led catastrophes.
The South was trying to figure out, how do we stop all of these Black folk from voting? If they continue to vote, we're in trouble. How do you say we don't want Black folks to vote without writing a law saying we don't want Black folks to vote? Mississippi said, oh, we've got this. We have figured out how to get around the 15th Amendment while systematically denying the vote to African Americans. And that was the Mississippi Plan of 1890. What Mississippi came up with was, we are going to use the societally imposed conditions on African Americans and make those conditions the access to the ballot box. What you say is, democracy is expensive. Elections are expensive. And if you're really invested, you should be willing to pay a small fee. A poll tax. It's not too much. It sounds so reasonable. But when you begin to think about what that means, you can pay for food or you can vote. You can pay for some clothes for your children or you can vote. And then the literacy test.
The literacy tests are misnamed in a sense because they weren't really tests of one's literacy. They were traps. They were designed to never let you be able to answer them correctly.
I actually took out one of the old literacy tests from Alabama. My class of second and third year law students could not pass the literacy test.
There were literacy tests, poll taxes,
grandfather clauses, all white primaries, property clauses.
If this one doesn't get you, this one will. If this one doesn't get you, this one will.
There were this raft of different laws that were called the Black Codes. And those laws criminalized basic normal behavior. It was a crime to be on a city street without having a place to go. It was a crime not to have a job, even if what you were doing was looking for work. If you were caught loitering, meaning you were waiting for your wife in a store, that could be a pretext for arresting you, incarcerating you, and permanently disenfranchising you.
That felony disfranchisement coming out of Florida in 1868, what that does is it strips you of your right to vote. It is a way to neutralize the 15th Amendment.
Virtually overnight, African Americans are eliminated from the electorate in the South. So you go from having Black governors and senators to having almost no, if not any, Black voters that were able to participate in elections.
In Mississippi, during Reconstruction, African American voter registration was almost 67%. By the time we have fought the Nazis and we are moving into the Cold War, where the U.S. is really holding up as the leader of the free world, only 3% of age-eligible African Americans were registered to vote in the South. 3%.
The word says, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. I'm gonna praise him, I gotta get it up.
My name is Desmond Meade. I grew up in Miami, Florida. I am what we call a returning citizen. Returning citizens are people with previous felony convictions.
You know, I used to tell people that my story didn't have a happy ending because I lived in Florida, where over 1.68 million people had a lifetime ban from voting and other things.
After graduating high school, I went into the service. When I returned home, I was addicted to drugs. And I was in and out of jail. And I ended up checking myself into drug treatment. I experienced a transformation. What have I done with my life to make a difference?
Florida leads the nation in denying the right to vote to one specific group, felons.
For years, we have lobbied politicians to change these old Jim Crow laws, and we were not able to accomplish anything.
If there's 1.5 million convicted felons in Florida and they're suddenly all qualified to vote, that universe of people are probably going to be more inclined to favor the Democratic Party.
What data is there to support that?
None.
So if the politicians did not have the political strength or courage to actually change the policies, then the next best thing was to let the citizens take it into their own hands. In October of 2014, we launched the ballot initiative. All of the experts thought that it was impossible to even get on the ballot. But this was an organic grassroots movement. We knocked on a lot of doors.
We're gonna change the history.
We made a ton of phone calls.
We're talking to voters about Amendment 4, the Voting Restoration Amendment on the ballot this November. Have you heard about it?
And our message was very simple. When the debt is paid, it's paid. And that this was an all-American issue that impacted people from all walks of life.
I'm a 20-plus year conservative Republican. I bring that up not to make an issue of it, but to actually not make an issue of it. This issue isn't about politics, it's about people.
Out of all the civil rights, nothing speaks more to citizenship than being able to vote.
Today is midterm election day. Voting's going to be in full swing here in just a few hours.
Voters in Florida are preparing to vote on a measure that would restore voting rights to 1.4 million people. 1 in 5 African Americans in Florida and 10% of the state's adult population.
Amendment 4, if it passes, is expected to change the shape of Florida's electorate for decades to come.
Millions of votes already cast here in Florida, but millions more will vote today.
It looks like Amendment 4 will pass. Amendment 4 passing by a wide margin, 64% there.
I need every returning citizen to get on this stage. When Amendment 4 passed, there was a feeling of joy and appreciation for folks to be able to participate in our democracy.
My God, I am feeling like on cloud 9 right now.
That population in Florida and around the country, they are the legacy of the Black Codes. They are the legacy of the Mississippi Plan. They are the legacy of attempts to permanently disenfranchise African Americans and to block their participation in society.
Birth of a Nation, it's based on a novel called The Klansman, which is a glorification of the Ku Klux Klan. Why is the Ku Klux Klan glorified? Because it saved the South from the horrors of black men holding office and being corrupt.
You get to the early 1900s, and you have the reign of terror from the Ku Klux Klan. And what you see is almost a total purge in lots of the former states of the Confederacy of black political participation at the butt of a gun, at the butt of threats of violence, through lynching and chaos.
There was terrorist violence on a massive scale in the South. Between 1880 and 1950, somewhere around 4,000 Americans are lynched, and almost all of them African Americans.
So let me tell you a story about Maceo Snipes. Maceo Snipes was a World War II veteran. When you have fought fascist and you have fought for democracy, you want some of that democracy for yourself. He came home to Georgia, and Maceo was determined to vote. There was an election going on, and Eugene Talmadge was running for governor.
The federal government is working consistently to tear down states' rights.
And Talmadge was running on the platform to, as he said, keep the Negroes where they belong. And so Maceo goes down, and there's a sign that says something to the effect of, first Negro that votes, that'll be the last thing he ever does. Maceo was like, I fought fascists, what you got? So Maceo went in there and he cast his ballot. He was the only black person in Taylor County, Georgia, that voted in 1946. Maceo goes home. Nothing happens for a few days. And then he goes to his door. White man says, could you step out on the porch? Maceo's like, sure. And then he sees 3 additional white men. And then he hears, and it was a firing squad. And they laid Maceo out. The message was really clear. You vote, you die. Election day terrorism was designed to provide the kind of intimidation that said if all of the pieces of the Mississippi plan can't stop you, we've got some bullets and a rope that will. And this is why you see the kind of insurgency happening in the black community that leads into the civil rights movement. This kind of, I shall not be moved.
Will be done.
My name is Roosevelt Lee. I went out to Liberty to try to register. And the next day when I went back to my job, the man fired me. After being questioned, I was carried into a room where a police officer came in and got a rope and said, okay, nigga, get up from here and let's go. We're going to have a hanging here tonight, and you're going to be first.
Weeping on, no more. Weeping on.
In my life, I never would have imagined I would have the honor to stand here. And when I got the request, my very next moment was to call my mom and my dad. My parents, Reverend Robert Abrams and Reverend Carolyn Abrams. You see, my father was arrested at the age of 14 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. He was arrested for helping to register black people to vote. My mother was doing the same work. She was just smart enough not to get caught, but all of that started here in Selma.
No more.
Selma, Alabama is located in Dallas County. 17,000 of the county's residents are Negroes. However, only 1.7% of these are registered voters. The Negroes of Selma, Alabama want to vote.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street. You beat people bloody in order that they will not have the privilege to vote. You can turn your back now and you can keep the club in your hand, but you cannot beat down justice. And we will register to vote because as citizens of these United States, we have the right to do it.
Well, we all are.
Selma really awakened the nation. In Selma, Sheriff Jim Clark was refusing to let them register to vote. They wouldn't even pretend to go through the motions.
I want to start out by commending you, the Negro citizens of Selma, for standing up. Sooner or later, Sheriff Clark will understand that he's dealing with a people that will not stop until they have full freedom and human dignity.
Dr. King and a large number of Selma Negroes marched through the city streets in small groups to the county courthouse. One woman, Mrs. Amelia Boynton, was grabbed by the sheriff and hustled along the sidewalk into the custody of deputies.
Dr. King and I, we had been working together to get a civil rights bill passed. We went back and we met with President Johnson. And he said, well, I know you need voting rights, but we just had a civil rights bill passed. I just don't have the power to go back to Congress for another civil rights bill. I know it's needed, but I don't have the power. And he must have said, I don't have the power half a dozen times. When we left, I asked Dr. King, well, what are you gonna do? He said, we're gonna get the president some power.
The Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee has a statement.
We, the Negro citizens of Dallas County and other Alabama Blight Belt counties, are marching today from Selma to Montgomery.
A couple of hundred people showed up. John Lewis led the march.
We're marching today to dramatize to the nation, dramatize to the world, that hundreds and thousands of Negro citizens of Alabama, but particularly here in the Blight Belt area, denied the right to vote.
Then they get to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It's real quiet. They're like, where's everybody?
The Alabama State Patrol and Sheriff Jim Clark were on the other side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
It'll be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue. You've got 2 minutes to turn around and go back to your church. Is that clear to you? I've got nothing further to say to you. Troopers here, advance toward the group. See that they turn around and disperse.
You see people just stumbling. You see them being trampled, and the cameras are rolling.
That Sunday, everybody was watching the movie Judgment at Nuremberg, which was about Hitler's slaughter of the Jews.
They cut in to their movie of the week to show the footage of Bloody Sunday. The nation was appalled because one of the ways that Jim Crow worked so smoothly and so effectively is that you didn't have to see it. But when you see the violence raining down on people who were just fighting for the right to vote, it tells you that something is systemically, fundamentally wrong in this democracy.
It was ruthless and brutal and criminal. But it was what changed the South on voting rights.
A nationwide movement for voting rights erupted that week.
All over the country, there were protests, there were sit-ins.
My father saw it as a pivotal moment to seize upon America's angst so that Americans would come and say, yes, the cause is just, the time is now.
Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex and most difficult. But about this, there can and should be no argument. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
He ended his speech with, "And we shall overcome." That's the only time I saw Martin Luther King shed a tear. We gave him the power. All of us working together got the Voting Rights Act passed.
Lyndon Johnson understood that while he had been an impediment to civil rights for decades, the time had changed and it was time for him to change. But more importantly, he understood that if the power of the right to vote was truly made available, it would change the future of this nation.
I'm the product of the Voting Rights Act. An act that was bought and paid for on Edmund Pettus Bridge. Which took over to believe that they had the right to do that. Because when you stood up and went across that bridge, those were the wings of the eagles that Isaiah talked about. It may have looked like feet marching across the bridge, but that was flight.
Days after the Voting Rights Act was passed, there were federal officials in the South registering African Americans to vote for the first time in counties where Black people hadn't been able to register for decades. This was truly revolutionary.
By 1967, 2 years after the Voting Rights Act, almost 60% of Black adults in Mississippi registered to vote. Game changer.
September of 2018, I went home to visit my grandmother. And Grandma had a recliner that sat right next to her bed. When you go to visit my grandma, you sat down because you did not want to interrupt whatever it was she was watching. And so I sat on the bedside waiting for her attention, and she turned to me. And unprompted, my grandmother reached for my hand and she started telling me about the first time she voted. It was 3 years after the adoption of the Voting Rights Act, but it was the first time for most African Americans that they really would have a chance to participate in an election. And this was during a time where you put on your Sunday best and you would make an event out of going to vote. My grandfather called for her from the front room. Her name was Wilter, and he's like, "Wilter, come on." She didn't respond. Her nickname was Bill. And so then he yelled out, "Bill, it's time to go." My grandmother said she still didn't say anything. So he came back to find out why she hadn't responded. And she was frozen. She was afraid to go. And I remember her squeezing my hand and the feel of that paper-thin skin and the fragile bones, but the grip that she had on my hand where she said that it wasn't that she didn't want to vote, she was afraid of it. She was afraid of the billy clubs and the hoses and the dogs, and she did not believe that this time would be any different. She didn't believe that the power of democracy was finally hers. And my grandfather told her that she had to get up, that her children had been in trouble trying to guarantee this right, and that she owed it to them, if not to herself, to get up and vote. And she said she was still terrified, she was still deeply afraid of this moment, but she was also ashamed of herself. She was ashamed that she didn't want to reach for this power.